second annual James Mark Baldwin Developmental Forum Lecture Series. Today's speakers are Drs. Urie Bronfenbrenner and Ceci, both of the Department of Human Development and Family Studies at Cornell University. I would like to extend a special welcome to our fellow students from other universities who made the trip here, from Auburn, from Tuscaloosa, from Atlanta, to attend today's talk. James Mark Baldwin was a pioneering developmentalist who made major theoretical contributions to the field of psychology through his study of the mental and social development of children. This lecture series was established by the graduate students in the developmental psychology specialty in order to introduce the UAB community to the issues and challenges that face those who work in developmental psychology. It is the hope that this lecture series will provide us all with an enhanced perspective from which to view important topics which face our society. Last year's talk by Dr. Gene P. Sackett of the University of Washington reflected the multidisciplinary perspective that the developmental students and those who support this lecture series value. Today's talk will again embody this important aspect of academic life. And further in this vein, I would like to introduce Dr. Sharon Landesman-Ramey, co-director of the Civitan International Research Center, who holds appointments in psychiatry, psychology, sociology, pediatrics, and public health. Dr. Ramey will now introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Clancy. Welcome to the Civitan International Research Center and to this wonderful developmental forum that's jointly sponsored by the Department of Psychology and the Civitan Center. When thinking about how to introduce two such distinguished guests in a short time and still leave a few minutes for them to speak, I sort of thought about, well, what is this all about? And I think that today what we're seeing in having a joint presentation by Dr. Urie Bronfenbrenner and Ceci is something that I might give a subtitle of, and it would be Collaboration and Challenge within the Context of Friendship. And I have a wonderful story I'd like to share with you, and it will be brief. But it's that the members of the James Mark Baldwin Society met and, of course, independently think about all the exciting things they've read and ideas they've heard, and get to nominate someone that they'd like to bring to the UAB campus. And this year they came up with, as they always do, a short list, and they had two top candidates, and they just couldn't choose between these two top candidates, and so went around and sort of mentioned to us this dilemma. And although I am sure that you were aware that Dr. Ceci and Bronfenbrenner were both at Cornell University, in fact, they had been selected because of their independent lines of research in fairly divergent areas. And the fact that these two scientists and scholars are friends, have been so for many years, and have collaborated on numerous articles and research projects was not well known to the students making the nomination. And so when we said, well, you know, it would really be great if you had both of them, we bet they would enjoy it, having some extra hours to be with one another, and they could make a joint presentation. So it's one of those things that I think those of us who are psychologists and recognize the value of context, it does happen that when you're at the same university and someone has an office down the hall and you bump into each other, or you have a cup of tea together, or you hand a manuscript and say, what do you think of this? That sparks begin to fly, and there's often what we call the hum in the halls, and I'm sure that Cornell's halls will hum for years and years, even when Steve and Urie spend a few days somewhere else visiting. But indeed, they are friends. Urie, I know, has been a mentor in many ways to Steve, and my guess is that before I finish this sentence, Urie will interrupt me and say, and vice versa. Indeed, and I think that the development of their ideas is just phenomenal. Briefly, let me share with you some of Urie's exciting developmental trajectory. Urie earned his bachelor's at Cornell, went on for a master's at Harvard in psychology, and then got a PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Michigan, but had strong interest in mathematics and music along the way, so has not been limited only to psychology. Steve began his educational career at the University of Delaware, where he earned his bachelor's, went on to the University of Pennsylvania for his master's degree, and the University of Exeter in England for his doctorate, also in developmental psychology. Steve Ceci is known for his work in eyewitness testimony of children and children's memory, for his work in cognitive development from infancy forward, especially for his challenge to notions, traditional notions of what intelligence is about, and the limitations of traditional testing of intelligence, and the need to move into the everyday world and see intelligence realized. And he also has been someone who has stirred up the scientific field by raising questions about the nature and objectivity of peer review of manuscripts, by looking at human subjects and how we review applications and if we treat them differently if they're about controversial topics, and has looked at the accessibility of people's data sets and the degree to which we comply with our own ethical standards. So as you can tell, he is a Renaissance man, and in addition, he has worked with Urie on many exciting projects. Urie Bronfenbrenner is truly, I think, the most influential developmental psychologist, and I'm not going to just say living developmental psychologist, because of his conceptualization about the ecology of human development. And he is really currently the most cited developmental psychologist for this work. And it's work that I think Urie himself sees as very much in development. And even though it has been phenomenally heuristic for the field, and people are still studying work that Urie did decades ago, Urie hasn't stood still and continues to advance and enter into the more biological arena, and seeing that things like biology and environment shouldn't be so separated, which led them, I think, to their talk, which is something they have been working on for a very long time, on really the nature-nurture controversy, and they hope to move from how much to how. So Steve and Urie, welcome to UAB, and thank you for coming.
I have a story to tell you about yourselves. We got a letter of invitation with some enclosures. And one gets these, you know, and they're very nice letters. And they usually contain a list of the faculty and what they're done and what they're into. But the letter I got from here was different. It was very cordial and told about things. And then it had a list and description of the history and interests of all the graduate students. That had never happened before to me. And that's a single exception, a rather long, long list. And it tells you something about yourselves. There was no way I could have said no. No way that Steve could have said no. That kind of thing. It's hard to get to business because we've only been here a few hours, and the same qualities that we met in that letter of invitation are here, and it's just being a delight, intellectual, and in a deeper sense, the delight that comes from living and having others as friends. And it happens here very quickly. And don't think it's just you. There's a beautiful Maori song, some of you may know about the Maori, the ancient peoples who were in New Zealand, and the words go something like this. Do not think that love is born today. It is a gift to us from our ancestors. And that's perhaps a fitting theme for today. I understand that the full-length manuscript on which our presentation was based was made available to many of you. I should say where we come from, there are some who have read it. And those are mostly students. And there are some who haven't read it. And most of those are faculty. We've planned our presentation in a way that you will never forget, but planned it in such a way that both will have a special advantage from their genetically chosen path. And those who will profit at the beginning will be, of course, virtue is always rewarded, they will be the most to profit from the first part. But those who have read it will profit more from the second part. The last thing I have to point out to you is something you can't see. There are 3 of us up here. And you get 3 of us for 2. Mark Lensenweger, who's a developmental psychopathologist, is the 3rd author of the manuscript. And he's very much here in the person of the 2 of us. So, we begin. And this is going to be a developmental process. And we begin on familiar ground in terms of the mode in which we proceed. 3.5 decades ago, Anne Anastasi published a paper that became and still remains what we now call a citation classic. The paper posed a tall challenge to psychological science. Challenge appeared in the article's title: Heredity, Environment, and the question how. In her words, rather than seeking to discover how much of the variance was attributable to heredity and how much to environment, a more fruitful approach is to be found in the question how. There is still much to be learned about the specific modus operandi of hereditary and environmental factors in the development of behavioral differences. End quote. Today, 35 years later, the challenge still stands, this despite the fact that over the past decade, the classic behavior genetics paradigm has truly come into its own. But the answer to Anastasi's question how is not answered. And that is the challenge that we have taken on, to identify the mechanisms through which genotypes are transformed into phenotypes. We have been struggling with this challenge, as you've already heard, Sharon, for the past 2 years. The result is the 90-page manuscript, which is lurking around in somebody's wastebasket here. That also was recently submitted to the Psychological Review, which is the same journal in which Anastasi's classic paper was published back in 1958. Incidentally, we also sent her a copy of the manuscript. And just a few days ago, received a 2-page commentary, single space, that both for its scientific and its stylistic probity sets a model for us all. This at the ebullient age of 84. If time permits, I shall quote some of her comments, both pro and con. Can you hear me back there? Okay? Because I speak louder in my natural voice. But it's very uncomfortable for those here. We do not claim to present a definitive model. That should be clear. Rather, we propose a general theoretical and operational framework and a set of working hypotheses that, if applied, might eventually lead, no, not to the right answers, but rather to the right questions. Those that indicate the productive directions for future scientific work. In short, This is an effort at science in the discovery mode, with verification as yet far, far down the road, and even not yet in sight. Bear that in mind. To adumbrate our argument in evidence, taking as a point of departure a bioecological paradigm of human development that Steve and I have been working on, and in fact that's the title of this book, which I hope you know. If not, you'll want to know after we're finished. That's my part.
Urie gets a portion of the royalties. You want them all?
Trying to buy me off. Trying to buy me off, huh? All right, we'll see, Steve. All right. Now, this proposed model builds on, extends, and then modifies the classical paradigm of behavioral genetics. Specifically, in addition to incorporating explicit measures of the environment conceptualized in systems terms, and allowing for non-additive, synergistic effects in genetics-environment interaction, the model posits empirically accessible mechanisms called proximal processes, that's the name we use for them, through which genetic potentials for effective psychological functioning are actualized. Now, as we, after we lay this thing out a bit, you may want to ask us what we mean by that term, effective. And we shall answer. It is further argued that heritability, that is, the extent of variation that is attributable to actualized genetic potential, in fact varies markedly, much more markedly than has been reported in the literature, and systematically, that is, in a predictable fashion, as a function of then their proximal processes and conditions in the environment in which they function. Now, although a number of theorists have pointed to, sort of vaguely, to the existence of such variation, what distinguishes the present effort is the attempt to achieve the needed degree of specificity both in theoretical clarity and in research design, and in particular with respect to the nature and operation of the mechanisms involved, those proximal processes. Now, that specificity finds expression in a set of concrete hypotheses that are subject to rigorous experimental tests. Now, as an index of actualized genetic potential, we rely mainly on the most commonly employed measure of heritability, known as H squared. And as you sure know, in the case of, just to illustrate, in the case of twins, H squared is typically defined as twice the difference between the correlation for identical versus fraternal twins. And it is precisely here that Anne Anastasia levels her strongest criticism of our work. In her words, with regard to heritability, my reaction is that as an index, it is quite useless because of its intrinsic limitations. All the differences result almost as a statistical artifact from changes in the variability of either hereditary or environmental conditions. End quote. Several of our other critics have expressed similar objections to our work on that score. What is more, we fully agree with Anne Anastasia and with them on the general basis of their criticism. What's, in our view, heritability measures conceal much more than they reveal. They conceal much more than they reveal. As a result, they easily can, and they do lead to misinterpretations, as we shall see. But that's not our main complaint about them. You'll hear about our main complaint. Nevertheless, my colleagues and I continue to use both the concept and the measure, at least to hypothesis 5. But after that, for the remaining hypotheses, we shall contend that heritability coefficients are insufficient for investigating hypotheses regarding the joint effects of nature and nurture, and that this limitation applies even in relation to those hypotheses that make specific predictions about variation in h squared. In the original text, I had written something like, and what accounts for this irresponsible nonsense? And Steve struck it out. We take the high ground. We do so on two grounds, both of them high. First, in some instances, the heritability coefficient does in fact measure the outcome that a particular hypothesis predicts. An example is provided by our very first hypothesis. First hypothesis, in which we stipulate that the stronger the proximal process, whatever that is, the higher the heritability. But there's a second, more compelling reason why we find heritability measures practically useful, at least for starters. Namely, our biological model can reveal what they see.
Does it say it just the way you orated? I was just curious if you write that way, if it sort of is pronounced that way in your typewriter.
What do you suppose he means by that?
They conceal what we reveal. A sort of magic to it. I was envious. My typewriter doesn't write that way.
Steve, why don't you say what you mean? This is sheer corn. This is what this is.
Okay.
You know, it's the malarkey. That's how you get people's attention. I'm a ham. That's what he means. I'm a teacher. And they conceal a lot. You don't like the way to say it. For example, every systematic presentation of the classic behavioral genetics model points out that estimates of heritability are specific to the population for which they're calculated. But what does that term population mean? By what criteria does one differentiate one population from the next one? To our surprise, and I must confess we have been able to find very few answers to this fundamental question. That is in the research literature. And such answers as we have discovered are not very satisfactory. For example, the basic genetics texts, the biological texts on genetics, define population as, and I quote, interbreeding individuals who share a common pool of genes that are transmitted from one generation to the next. That gives us one population, as far as I know, for the whole human race. Not very helpful. By contrast, the bioecological model we'll be bringing here specifies 4 domains as sources of systematic variation and levels of heritability. The first of these, and in our view the most important, is proximal processes. And in a minute, we will give you a formal definition, soon to be followed by several concrete examples. But first we have to point out to you that call to your attention that word effective. We're only talking about the mechanisms for a particular kind of developmental outcome that we have referred to as representing effective psychological functioning. And here we are restricting ourselves to proximal processes as the mechanisms through which that outcome is attained. So this is a specific mechanism through which the developmental potential for a particular kind of outcome is actualized. not the whole affair. We're not saying, you know, how do you get to be, how do you actualize genetic potential for the destruction of self and others? That's not what we're about today. All right. So, what do we mean by proximal process? You can take your choice of the modality. I'll read. You can listen. You can look, or you can be confused.
Like us?
Yeah. Like doing it. Proposition 1. Especially in its early phases, and to a great extent throughout the life course, human development takes place through processes of progressively more complex reciprocal interaction. And that word reciprocal is very, very important. Reciprocal interaction between an active, evolving, biopsychological human organism and the persons, objects, and symbols in its immediate environment. Notice, persons, objects, and symbols. To be effective, that interaction must occur on a fairly regular basis over extended periods of time. And examples of proximal processes, that's not up there. How come you left that out?
I didn't know any. Sure, there's some, but I just...
Well, let me give you some. Come on, Steve.
All right,
Let me give you some.
Give me some.
Examples of proximal processes are found in parent-child and child-child activities, in group or solitary play, in reading, in learning new skills, in problem solving, in performing complex tasks, in acquiring new knowledge and know-how.
Well, hold on a minute. Having underscored the word reciprocal, what's so reciprocal about things like reading?
What's reciprocal things like reading? What do you mean? I mean, I'm reading this stuff.
Seems unidirectional. It's like,
Except when you interrupt. That's a very important question. So let me see if I can spell it out. We're talking here about reading what Jerry Bruner calls narrative, a story, a poem, an explanation. And as you read, if it's a story, you see the people. You have your own picture of who they are. You see them acting. You feel, you cry. Ready? Here. It's you responding, and you respond, and then you read on, and you begin to respond in another way. It's a joint project. And as you get into the book, you can't put it down. You can't put it down. Just as a matter of interest, how many of you here yourselves, I've asked this question of my students in my classes since the first class that I taught in 1939 And the question is, how many of you have read Under the Covers through the night, which you couldn't with a flashlight or something? How many of you here, honestly, you will notice that there's a gender difference and an age difference.
You sampled that quickly.
I spent 10 years as a clinical psychologist. I don't want any of that. You don't trust my intuition?
I just think maybe there might be some cohort differences in the availability of flashlights.
It's going to be difficult to keep this up, isn't it? You're not supposed to ask this, Steve. All right. What we're saying here is that proximal processes are the primary engines of effective development. Such processes take on different form and substance in different cultures. But every culture has it. Just take different forms. And every culture has stuff that is just as complex as other cultures, but in a different medium. The other day I got a letter from the former Soviet Union. It was a letter from a very close friend, and he said, the situation here is terrible. Worse than it has ever been in our history. For the first time in human history, Russia is losing its soul. The children and the people can no longer recite Pushkin from memory. That's a pretty complicated process. But it's part of your soul. Well, the formulation you have just heard also constitutes the first defining property of a more general paradigm that we refer to as bioecological model of human development, and that model also has a second defining property. Proposition 2. The form, the power, the content, and the direction of proximal processes affecting development vary systematically as a joint function of the characteristics of the developing person. For example, genetically based dispositions. Birth weight, I'm just picking stuff to illustrate the range here. Temperament, IQ, the big 5 personality things, and the little 5 personality things, which are never, that's a well-kept secret what the little 5 are. And for many, the big 5 are also. And the characteristics of the environment, both immediate, like right here, or the family, or the home, or the peer group, places where there's face-to-face interaction possible. Or more remote, like social class, like culture, like period in history, and so on. And finally, the nature of the developmental outcomes under consideration. The talents, the skills, the orientations, attitudes. That's what that's saying. The various terms in this definition, in these definitions, and their posited interrelationships are best clarified in the context of a concrete research example. And the data for this example are drawn from a longitudinal study by Mary Cecil Drillion, an extraordinary investigator far ahead of her time. She was professor of child development at the University of Edinburgh, the only woman in the faculty, and she was fired for failure to follow the medical model. You should know that. Her study of factors affecting the development of children of low birth weight compared to those of normal birth weight. But for present purposes, only the data for the latter, for the normal group, will show them to you. And for that was 164. This figure depicts the impact of a proximal process, in this instance mother-infant interaction, assessed at age 2, on the number of problem behaviors that these infants have exhibited at age 2 and again at age 4 as a function of 3 levels of social class. Low, medium, and high. Got that? And if we had time, I'd tell you about how she measured social class. In the usual way, plus on a neighborhood basis. So it was the people who lived there with these incomes and these occupations and so on. Nobody seemed to have noticed that. So Steve, let's have that one.
Urie, before you put it on, let's see if anybody in the audience can anticipate what Brilliant found. I mean, you've heard him say what hypothesis 1 was, so I'd be curious to know if anybody would anticipate what the impact of proximal processes on behavior problems would be. Any care to venture who has not read the manuscript? Oh, everyone has the handout. Oh, that's cheating.
Does everyone have the handout?
Well, don't look at it.
Put it away.
I'll ask them.
You heard what Stephen said. Put it away. And if you've read any of the answers to this, you are going to be deprived. You're going to be deprived.
Urie, I have a harder question that they can look at it and try to answer. What would be the differential impact of proximal processes? Would there be a differential impact in the 3 social classes, and why? It's that second one that they can have their cheat sheets. Any takers on that?
You heard Steve's question? Not just what would be the impact,
But why?
but how would it differ, if it does, in the 3 social classes, and why? He keeps wanting to say why. Always repeating it. No takers. No takers. No takers.
These people, unlike our colleagues, are unwilling to embarrass themselves. So maybe I should put it to you.
You mean like you and me?
Exactly.
Yes. At Cornell, one of the characteristics that we require of all members of the faculty and of all students whom we expect is that they be willing to make fools of themselves in public. In fact, that is, I'm being quite serious. There's a wonderfully written essay that was the address at the 75th anniversary of Cornell's being on the Cornell tradition, freedom and responsibility, by Carl Becker, a historian who was the authority on that and the authority on the Declaration of Independence, and the man who wrote like a clean, fine historian of European history. And he said, no, tradition. We know what that means. But the Cornell tradition has something special about it. Something impudent. Impudent. And a Cornell professor is one who thinks otherwise. I'm giving you permission to think otherwise at your university. To see whether, if asked to, given that freedom, you can carry. Yes.
Okay, I'll be presumptuous a little bit. The question is, will the impact of proximal processes on behavior problems differ in the 3 social classes? And if so, why?
Will you let them take it one at a time so they don't have to say why right away?
Okay.
All right? But then we can put it more simply. We can say, will it differ? And if so, where will it be strongest and where will it be weakest? And you've only got 3 possible answers. Your chance, likelihood of hitting it is pretty good. What do you got to lose? And you don't even have to say why yet. It's a different culture. Our problem at Cornell is at this point, the class is out of control. What?
Yes, it will change. It'll change the most for the lowest.
It'll change the, she says, it will change the most in the lowest.
You know, I should put it on because not everyone has it, I think. Is that correct? Only some people have the data in front of them, so maybe that's a
There we
bit
are.
unfair.
Shall I go through my act?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Figure 1 affects a proximal process at age 2 and on children's problem behaviors. This is problem behaviors going from 0 up to 10 at the top. Over here, this is at age 2. This is what happens at age 4. And this really is incorrect, the label. The hatched are low levels of process, and the solid are high levels of process. And the reason I say it's incorrect is this is not a measure of goodness. This is a measure of the capacity to engage in these complex, this is the capacity to reduce problem behaviors. Whether it's good or bad is irrelevant. And what you heard was that the effect is biggest at age 4 in the lowest SES. Isn't that nice? The process works best where it's needed. We live in the best of all possible worlds.
Is that always the case?
Don't ruin the story.
Wondering. I seem to remember in a later page it changes somewhat.
We'll see. Any questions? Any questions? Mother-infant interaction, by the way, represents a good example of reciprocity, a proximal process, because when the infant does something, the mother typically responds, and vice versa. Each responds to the other, but in her own way. It's like a ping pong game. It escalates as the players, get into the game. Each doing his own. The shots are theirs, but responding to the others differentially depending on what they get back or have sent. That's the proximal process. Any question? Any question? Do you have any question?
So far I'm following you.
You're not alleging that.
I'm a Cornell.
She goes first. She's a Cornell.
I don't understand your treatment. The up and down, it says average number of problem behaviors.
Right.
So, starting the left-hand side.
Left-hand side, not much differentiation.
But I just want to know, it means that in the high SES, for those who have a smaller number of process,
Lower level of process.
lower level of process.
There's less back and forth.
Right, then the average number is 3. For those in the mid, the average number is 4, and for those in the low, it's about the same. And then at age 4, it's 4.
The system explodes.
Okay. Now, what you're saying, I don't understand what affects me, but anyway, what you're saying is that the hatch stage is in the lower level
Of reciprocal interaction.
reciprocal interaction. Is also a lower level problem behaviors. And
No. Here, let me spell it out. Here are kids whose mothers don't interact with them very much, right? And it's low SES, and they have an average of 9, simultaneously exhibiting 9 proximal processes. Mothers in that...
Nine problems.
No, not 9, I'm sorry, 9 problem behaviors. Why don't you do this? I mean, I always get things upside down.
Now you're doing fine.
Here are kids and mothers in that same lower social class who somehow managed to play the game.
Now I understand.
And what happens is the problems have,
Thank you.
all right, magic. Clear now? Thank you. I got off the script, didn't I? And what's the biggest effect? Biggest effect was where you saw it. In the worst place. I apologize, Steve, I ruined it. Lost my cue, you know. And you're the one who had the hard job. Still have it. So hang in there, friend.
Ran away.
Yeah. Yeah.
For the low SES group, is this the average number of problems for a group, human-wide, who had high level of interaction? And is it the same group that we're talking about who has low levels? Is it low levels of good and high levels of bad produce this differential outcome within the same people?
Let me say it in English straightforward, without reference to the grammar, right? Age 2. There were some kids who were, there were 3 kids living in 3 social classes, and we got data on how much the mother interacted with them, right? And the only way we could, how shall I say, get them, differentiate them in terms of the data available for us in the research report, where it was in terms of a dichotomy, high and low. High and low. Later on we'll show you some where we have intermediate levels in the intensity of the ping pong. Okay? Now these at age 4 are the same kids, of course. They've grown up to age 4. Here you did see systematically that those kids who had a low level of interaction consistently had more problems, but not very many, and there wasn't much differentiation here. You know, nobody's going to make a big story out of that, except that it looks like this ping pong game makes some difference at age 2. But by the time these kids are 4, this level of playing at age 2 changes this picture so that what was only at this much of a difference at age 2 in lower social class is now the whopper. And let me remind you, this is age 4. In a couple of years, these kids are going to go into school. And they're coming to school with this, depending on. Now I can also mention to you, what is the percentage of kids in lower social class who got this kind of high level of mother-infant interaction? Not very encouraging under conditions in Edinburgh back in the 50s. Approximately 13%. So you got a double whammy. But if they managed it, it made one hell of a difference. Now is it clear? All right.
Urie, just a parentheses, in case some people are wondering. I don't know the answer to this, and I'm not sure. I don't think it can be discerned from the data, but the question is whether something that happened in the first 2 years of life are establishing behavior at age 4, or more likely the fact that they've had good levels or poor levels of process throughout the whole 4 years.
We cannot establish that because she was not able to take these measures at age 4 again. And the reason was that she wasn't following the medical model, and they forbid her not to gather these data, but to, this was a nursing school, by the way, and she was teaching, it was a nursing faculty, and she had nurses in training. They are the ones who she trained to gather these data, and they forbid her to use students. She had no grants. And she comments, I couldn't get the measures again here. But she got observed to do that, or at least interviewed to do that. And with 138 cases, or whatever it was I told you, you can't do it all by yourself. Although she did a lot of it herself. And the case reports in these cases are glorious. I mean, look, it's live. You see, here's this home, here's what's going on, and then they had this metric. Also, she didn't know statistics very well. There are only a couple of correlations. No significant sets. Don't believe a word of it. We'll talk tomorrow about why you shouldn't believe a word of it. I mean, why you should believe a word of it, despite the fact that she didn't know. Because while she may not have been using statistics, she was using something much more important, rigorous thought. The talk I'll be giving tomorrow somewhere, somehow, now has a title. It's called Science versus Methodology. All right. Any questions? Any questions? Notice what we've just shown you is that the same difference in proximal process appears to have had greater impact by age 4 and far greater impact in reducing behavior problems for children in the most impoverished environment. I want you to remember that. That's what you've just said. The same findings have been replicated, by the way, in the NYSL. What does the L stand for? Longitudinal study. Same pattern. Nobody's done it. We did it. You know, got the thing put it on our computer. But the trends are weaker because they're using the home. And the home doesn't have a good measure of proximity. The context and the process are all mixed up. And one of the essential features of this is there's a difference between the process of interaction and the context in which it's occurring. What am I going to do without Steve? Well, what is it you do when you let on the boat, when you let no, it doesn't go anywhere, just let the motor run. What is it? Huh?
Live.
Oh, the sails will upgrade. But that's what I was looking for.
I knew you were class well.
Yeah, I'm looking for the love. But it'll be worthwhile. From a methodological viewpoint, note that the research design illustrated in this figure permits the simultaneous investigation of both Proposition 1 and of Proposition 2. We refer to this kind of a model as a process, person, context, time model. PPCT for short.
Am I missing anything?
No. Are there any questions at this point? Steve, over in that corner.
Oh, question.
Yeah, no, we've been at Luff, but it's over there north by east.
Goals for, let's say, amount of time that mothers spend within the home with these children, working mothers versus those who are home all day.
This is the 1950s. That is not in the model, but it's quite clear from her description of the neighborhood that a lot of these mothers were working. And of course, what you're pointing out, now if we were doing this, we'd look at that. But we don't have the data in a systematic way.
Any other
But
questions?
but she had it.
Yeah, it looks like the relative reduction in the lower group is greatest, as you pointed out, but it also looks, although I can't tell because of statistics unavailable, but it also looks like the absolute number of behavioral problems are lowest in that interactive group compared to the middle and higher groups. Is that true?
As a matter of fact, it is. One of the few correlations she doesn't give is in support of that situation. situation.
What's the explanation for that?
You want to know the explanation. Do you have one to suggest?
No, I'd rather hear yours.
You are silent, sir. We'll come back to it.
Well, Urie, I have a couple questions if they don't.
Any other questions? Steve, you can catch hell from Steve if you don't have any other questions.
Well, it just demonstrates what a poor teacher you are, because I mean, they're complex data. That's all I meant.
You got a hand back there, Steve.
To the question of genetics, it seems like the impact of low processes is greater than the impact of high processes, so that does seem to make a statement about genetics. In other words, you can prevent the problem behaviors from getting that much worse, but you can't necessarily impact those problem behaviors beyond certain points. So there's the genetic versus show up by age 4.
Well, she's actually touching on an interesting question that she's a little bit ahead of us in terms of the confident versus dysfunctional outcome. Maybe we better hold off until the next one
I think so.
to talk about that. It's another way of saying we don't know the answer, but no, actually we do.
Any more questions that you have, Steve? That I didn't
Well,
deal with?
again, since you have talked to Sandy and I wasn't aware of what her answer to you is, my assumption is that she would suggest that there are genetic influences in the child's shaping of her own environment, in this case, her own mother.
That's exactly what Sandy says, as you know. She's saying, well, that's obvious. These are genetically similar individuals. And it's selective, you know, they match up, and you get you get this more effective result because the good genetics of the mother ensures the good genetics of the child, and that's why you get these correlations. And what do I say back to Sandy Scar? Do you know her famous presidential address? How many of you actually read it? Oh, you should read it.
It's in the 1992 January issue of Child
Yes,
Development.
it's the first piece. And the lead off for the year of 1992. This year is going to be written about in history as a very important year of a real turmoil and change in our field. Genetics is right up there. And so she says that. And what do I say in return? And I say I in this instance because I was the one. We're old friends, good friends, over the years. And been arguing the whole time these issues. Any idea what she said? What I said, Sandy, first of all, what does she say, those of you who read it, about where environment does operate? Where does environment operate? Can't ask you a question when you haven't read the answer, right? She says it only operates in poor environments. In environments, as she calls them, what is that phrase?
Outside
the normal species range. If you're in the normal species range, genetics takes care of the interaction. Here we go. It's working here. Right. Well, but wait. She turns turns out to be right after all, in a way. All right, so you see we have here some evidence for proposition 1 and proposition 2. But no genetics yet, as you were saying. There's nothing about genetics in there. We'll come to that in a moment. You have a question?
Yes, I do have a question. It just occurred to me when you showed that slide. It seems to me that the majority of people existing in the world are likely to be in that low group. Now, does Sandra Scar imply that the normal species range is what high and mid-SES people exist in?
I think it's fair to say that she never tells you what that is. Her definition of the normal species range is the environment that prevailed during the evolution of the species. It's hard to know. Now, we're going to move a little faster. We wanted you to do this so you're clear on the concepts, of what we're saying here. And of course, there's nothing here yet that answers the biggest question. How do you assess the environment? Well, we already told you. We're going to use h squared. And it's there, but you can't see it. We've hidden it on purpose in a third dimension that's not visible from this frontal view. See, the frontal view you can't see in the third dimension. And we did that on purpose in order to focus your attention on this key intermediate link, the powerful effect of proximal processes on developmental outcomes and the systematic ways in which this effect varies. So we got systematic variation as a function of all these things. How are you going to test the actualization of genetic potential? Well, we've already answered.
But you still haven't answered the $64,000 question. Can you rule out genetics? Where are genetics in the model?
They're not there. Can you rule them out?
Yeah, how would you do that?
First of all, you can't rule them out. They're always going to be there. But what you can do is to demonstrate that it ain't only genetics. And the way we suggest doing that is, of course, in these models, you include subjects of contrasting consanguinity, twins and identical and fraternal, or nowadays, much easier to find, own children and stepchildren. I mean, we don't have to wait. Also, if these proximal processes are as powerful as we say, you don't need big numbers. Because if you can vary proximal processes and get these results, they're going to be statistically significant with much lower ends. If we're right. If we're right. And then, what happens is, you see if these heritabilities change, and we say they do. That's our first hypothesis. And what's our second hypothesis, based on what you saw here, that goes along with proposition 2? Where are proximal processes going to produce the highest heritabilities? In which social class? If this is right, where will they have the biggest effect in changing the amount of heritability from low to high? In the low. Just bear that in mind. Now, Steve is asking, can we prove it? And the answer is yes, because We also suggest experimental change over extended periods of time in an experiment in which you're going to give different advice to mothers. You know, good advice. One, encouraging proximal processes. The other, using the good advice that we already have, and it's not bad. And see if we can change it. And if we can change it, it means we're getting effects that can't be environmental because we randomize the design.
Can't be genetic.
Right? Can't be only genetic.
Only genetic. Right, yeah.
Can't be only genetic if we can produce big changes, and we're saying yes. Even though the proximal processes also necessarily have a genetic component. But that's all right. If you let them happen over here, don't let them happen over there. And you're doing this environmentally, you're controlling genetics. And it's not eugenics. Are we being clear? Now, so what do the results show? Can't tell. No cases are done. No violence. Nothing to be done. Nothing appears to be practicable. And that's what needs to happen. The developmentalists and the behavior geneticists have to get together and try some of these things. But we don't have it yet. Why? Because the model requires 2 stages, both in the same design. However, we have some evidence. We have evidence for only stage 1 models, this is one, in which you have the effect of the proximal process and the outcome. And we have quite a few of those. Well, give you some examples. And we have a very few in which you have heritabilities in different environments without the proximal process. But because you can show in other studies that the better the environment, the higher the proximal process, we have a kind of attenuated, low-level, inefficient measure of an indirect effect. You're looking at your watch. Move us faster, I think.
Well, I got an appointment in 15 minutes, so I may have to cut out.
Is this beauty? He's hard. He's hard.
This guy is hard to rein in. I've been doing it for 13 years.
And you see how successful he is.
Exactly. He told me Friday at SRCD, make sure everyone is exactly on time or cut them off, He was the biggest overtime person.
Steve, come on, tell him 5 minutes.
It's true.
Well, you can see where we're going. And these indirect, incomplete results are very interesting. And they're a convenient way to introduce a couple of our other hypotheses. In this case, the data are drawn from a research project being conducted by Steve Small and Tom Luster. We are indebted to them for the material and also for their marvelous exploratory initial analyses, which when we saw them, we said, hey, these data can be used to do a stage 1 thing. In the following analyses, with their data, we investigated the differential effects of parental monitoring on school achievement for high school students, all high school students except for those who were absent on that day, living in the 3 most common, this is in a county, all in a county in Wisconsin, living in the 3 most common family structures found in a sample of 4,000 cases. And representing, as I already said, all the high schools in one county. And the sample is further stratified by 2 levels of mother's education. Those with only high school, those beyond high school. And 3 levels of parental monitoring on a scale ranging from 0 to 10. And looking at grade point average across all grades. as the outcome. And we have kids in two-parent biological families, in single-parent families, and in step families. And this is important to make clear because they didn't. No, we didn't. You should understand, in my childhood, that's a very, very disorienting thing. It means the police are coming. And you're going to be hidden in a cellar. It takes a long time to not to get disoriented when you hear it. And in fact, I mixed it up. These are children in step family. Where's the figure?
I have a figure here, but before I put it up, let's try again. Maybe we'll have more luck this time and see if they can anticipate some of the results. I mean, what would you expect, given what's been said so far, in terms of, take the easiest case, the 2 levels of maternal education, and then going from there, the 3 levels of family structure?
And the outcome here is
getting good grades.
getting good grades.
High school. Yeah, monitoring, maybe you should explain
Yeah,
that.
I will explain it. What very widely used now, the mother is asked, usually the mother, and sometimes as in this instance, the child, these are adolescents, you can ask them. And there are questions like, but the question was always asked in this case of parents. Do your parents expect you to be home at a certain time? Do your parents know where you are when you're out?
It's not just academic monitoring that you do your homework.
No, it's not. No. It's all like this, and it is. Do your parents want you to want to know the names of your friends? All right. Do your parents know where you are after school? That's monitoring, right? Got it?
It can include, though, to answer your question, are your parents aware when you're studying in your room?
Yeah, you could. Not in this particular.
More broad sort of structure.
Well, this is one of the problems in our field, that there is not a theoretical, very good theoretical thinking about what it is you're trying to assess. And it's, it is a descendant of Dust Bowl empiricism. Got to measure, throw it in. What other questions? Get more questions to get more reliability. We're not really concerned with what the conceptual meaning is. We'll get back to that. Of this question versus that question, so long as they correlate. And you can get lots of things to correlate that don't belong together. And our whole system of trying to build indices by taking those that correlate together without worrying about what they say, since they correlate and they sound right roughly. We're going to make a big deal of that. But in this study, those were the ones they picked, not the kind that you picked, which they could have easily done. Is that all right, Steve?
Yeah. So what do you expect in terms of getting good grades as a function of monitoring among, say, high and low educated mothers?
You got it.
How about the slightly more difficult, the 3...
By the way, did you hear that answer? Yeah, could you say it again a little louder, just so people know, or can you say it, Steve?
Yeah, she said that she would predict that it would have more of an impact among people at the lower level, at lower educated families.
In lower educated families, proximal processes would make a bigger difference than up there because of the reasons we've discussed before, right? Or what we saw before in the previous case.
Well, she didn't offer her reason. I assume that's the case, yeah. What would you expect to...
Did I misrepresent you? No, okay. She did misrepresent. I did misrepresent her.
Okay, how about expectations in the three types of family structure?
Biological two-parent families, single-parent mothers, by the way, living without another adult in the household. Tom and small. What's this first?
Small mustard?
See, small. Think very carefully about these matters, as you'll see. And the third is the stepfamily. So where's...
Well, in the interest of time, maybe I should ask you, because we're getting towards that bewitching hour. So.
Well, does anybody want to make a prediction? Where the slope will be strongest? Single parent, because it's the worst environment. Let's show them. Okay, I get to say the interesting part. This is mothers with no education beyond high school. This is mothers with some education below high school. This is the grade point average GPA on here. This is the fit with a quadratic fit, which we had a theoretical reason for doing because we expected it to be a curve of this kind. And the solid blocks are the two-parent biological family, and the triangles are child living with its own mother and stepfather. Now, what did you point out? They were careful. They didn't say just step-parent. They said which step? Whose step? And finally, the empty square living with the mother only. What do you see? How's your hypothesis doing? Huh? Who should be doing best? You said, and we would all say on the basis of what we told you so far, it ought to be over here, and and the greatest good should be for these families over here. These are the averages for the groups, and we've got the reversals and patterns. And that was our hypothesis, because we have two different kinds of hypotheses. Here is developmental competence. You got to do something well. In the other case, you have reducing developmental dysfunction, reducing problems. And our hypothesis was that the effect would be different. Because virtually any parent can be helpful to a child in emotional distress. They can comfort, they can catch attention, they can distract. But if you're going to be competent, you've got to have resources. You've got to have information. You've got to have books. You've got to know things that you can tell your child when they ask. And you've got to have a stable environment in which that kind of process can take place without too many interruptions. So we have this differential prediction that it depends, as it says in Proposition 2, on the nature of the outcome. And if you're looking for, and notice what this might mean in terms of, if you think about survival on an evolutionary basis, any mother can take a child and hold and so on and bring him to the point where little one, quiet, But in order to get him into university, you got to have some things. And if you have them, and you have both, of course, the average up here is only B. Modeling doesn't do it alone. You got to have other proximal processes that have content. And of course, we're saying squareds in here, and the difference in h squared in the best environment when you put proximal processes in is going to be tremendous. And if you don't, even in the best environment, and you can see why we want to make that distinction, it's as bad as anything else. The proximal process is the engine of developmental. And our hypothesis, when you calculate the h squared, and with this kind of n you could even do it, you're going to get the biggest change in h squared. And we already have h squareds that go as low as 0 for certain environments. But we don't have the proximal processes level. And we have them as high as 85. And in one case, we have the 85 in the poorest environment. But if we have time, we'll come to that. So, Steve, I heard you when you said we had a blue. I do get the impression that we're getting that you're understanding us better than they did in a half-hour presentation. And that's RCT. So, resources and stability you gotta have. And as you know, single-parent families and step-families are not very stable and predictable in terms of what happens to kids. Clear? They're not good places for the realization of genetic potential. Steve, if I may, do we dare ask the question? This one? We're just too low on time. I'll be very quick. You don't believe I can do it, huh? We also show that proximal processes not only raise the level of outcome, they also reduce the variance. Can you show that one quickly? Because it tells its own story. And they do so by pulling up the outliers, those who had the potential but didn't have the proximal process. And when you put in the proximal process, you reduce the total variability so that there are more people who are able to function at their own, at a higher level. And as you see, these are variance. These are, I think, standard deviation. And mothers with no education beyond high school, levels of monitoring ranging from 1 to 3, and this is the standard deviation. And as you raise the proximal process, the standard deviation goes down, especially in a good environment, which means that you're going to maximize h squared, not only because the mean is rising, but because the environmental spread, the spread due to environment is being reduced. So what's left is going to be genetic variation. There always is something. However, when you look at this stuff, we're nowhere near the top. There's still lots and lots of room for environments that we don't provide. I mean, our environments don't have as much proximal process, they haven't used up the possibilities, which means we got a lot of genetic potential. I guess, Steve, we just got to go fast, and I'll tell you the other thing. What's wrong with h squared? What's wrong with h squared? Well, h squared is the difference. We have our nice formula here.
Yeah, you want that?
Yeah, I think so, before you tie it all up. And just to remind people, here's h squared. Notice it has two parts. So h squared differs either because monozygotics are getting more similar, or dizygotics are getting more different, or both is happening. And we have a series of hypotheses that say that change is going to be not because of this, but because of this. what's going to happen under high proximal processes and in good environments is that kids who are different genetically are going to get even more different genetically because they're different genetic potential.
More different behaviorally.
Behaviorally, sorry. More different behaviorally because their genetic potentials of difference are arising.
And being actualized.
And being actualized. So they should be more different. So that this whole thing is really the effect of proximal processes and variations in h squared is reflecting the fact that in good environments, those who are different become even more different. Notice there's nothing here that in any sense says genetics is not important. It's just that you've got to provide the soil in which the flowers can grow. And if you have different forms of the species, and the soil is good, wow, do you get different fluorescence. Because they're different in their potential. And we have some indirect evidence that that's exactly what happened. We got some the other day from our friends in Sweden who read this report and said, we'll try it out on our data. And sure enough, there it was. What changed was that under good proximal. No, they didn't have proximal processes. They just had the indirect testing. But in the better environment, and of course, Sandy Scarr found that out long ago. And there are several other studies that show that. That what's changing, if you look at the data, instead of this big blob out here, which we say varies from 4 different reasons, you find that what's happening, the h squared is changing because some kids are becoming even more different because they are more different, and you put them in the right environment. In this case, you engage them in the kinds of activities in which they could learn to play the piano. And lo and behold, turns out that one of them plays piano better than the other. Amazing. All right. Thank you, Steve. Is there anything else we should say before we give them up? I think not.
In the interest of time, we should probably
Go.
go.
This is, we're going to try to integrate it all, and this is Steve's baby, and I think it's a beauty. Go ahead.
Well, it takes at least 2 to make a baby for this species.
Yes,
my knowledge.
we are.
Except in hermaphroditic species. Okay. We've already described to you now the critical components of the model. I think we're obliged to put it together into a model that captures some of the complexity that Urie has been sharing with us. And this is our candidate for a model. Urie is big on color, so he has to color everything. It's sort of frivolous in my book, but I indulge him. This is viewed from the bottom upwards, the biosocial trajectory that Urie's been describing this afternoon. From the very beginnings, the organism gets its impetus and its direction from the biological endowment of the parents.
Steve, what did you do with the man and woman down at the bottom?
You wanted the color one. That's in the black and white version.
He had two, he had a little
We had an alternative one that had a man and a woman here and a little baby up there. Yeah, they have it in their
Oh, they
handout.
got it. You did.
Yeah.
I see. You gave them the color and they got the form.
That's right. But although the biological endowment is important in determining the direction and giving the impetus, as you can see, it's really the proximal processes that are actualizing the potential, that are translating genotypes into phenotypes. Hence, you see that it's proximal processes that are making much larger differences in these developmental outcomes and the corresponding h squares than even the environments in which they operate. If you contrasted the distances between a less competent good environment, low process, and a lowest competent poor environment, low process, the difference is not nearly as great as if you contrasted high and low process within either environment. So let me just cut to the chase in the interest of time. The conclusion that Urie was arriving at just at the very end, that this idea actualized genetic potential is important because it captures the hidden meaning that I think most behavior geneticists would agree that H squared really doesn't tell you how much elasticity is in the organism. And I don't care if the H squared coefficient is 1.0. It doesn't carry any known or even knowable implications for how much plasticity is in the organism to go beyond that. And we didn't go into
And that's molecular genetics.
well, breakthroughs in molecular genetics, but as Dobzhansky had said, I think so aptly in the mid-50s, that unless you map the genotype over the full range of environments, of ideologies, of new societies, and so on, you really never know what kind of limits one can reach. So the old wisdom, nature proposes, environment disposes, is in need of a little bit of emendation because both the proposition and the disposition are jointly determined by both genes and environment. And I want to just conclude by reading a quote from a rather obscure developmental psychologist from, I think, Cornell University in the late 70s in a book on the ecology of human development. And he said, and I'll quote, I don't know if he had tenure or not, but he should have gotten it because he wrote with a certain flair. He said, species Homo sapiens appears to be unique in its capacity to adapt to, tolerate, and especially to create the ecologies in which it lives and grows. Seen in different contexts, human nature, which I had once thought of as a singular noun, turns out to be plural and pluralistic. For different environments produce discernible differences, not only across but within societies, in talent, temperament, human relations, and particularly in the ways in which each culture and subculture brings up the next generation. The process and product of making human beings human clearly varies by place and time. Viewed in historical as well as cross-cultural perspective, this diversity suggests, and here we get to it, the possibility of ecologies as yet untried that hold a potential for human nature as yet unseen, perhaps possessed of a wiser blend of power and compassion than has thus far been manifested. Thank you. Okay, now we should give them a chance for a final question or two.
Final question or two, but at the same time, I'm sure other than some you have to leave. You know, there are other things to be done besides this game. So feel free to leave. But if you have other questions, are we okay to stay by?
Yeah, I think Kathleen. Well, it is indeed an honor for me to present these plaques on behalf of the developmental psychology specialty, the students and the faculty of the UAB Psychology Department, the Civitan International Research Center, and the entire UAB community. To Dr. Urie Bronfenbrenner and Dr. Stephen Ceci for this wonderful gift that you have given us today. It's truly wonderful. Thank you very much. And the plaque reads the second annual James Mark Baldwin Lecture, Urie Bronfenbrenner and Stephen Ceci, March 29, 1993, Department of Psychology and the Civitan International Research Center, University of Alabama at Birmingham. And I think we should give them another hand.
I've never seen a plaque before that had both names on the same plaque.
You notice how ebullient he is because it's Bronfenbrenner and Ceci. Why doesn't it say names listed in alphabetical order? Or by coin toss?
Go on, say the rest of that.
Well, I would,
With no indication of, not to be interpreted as implying.
as implying content or priority. Well, Urie, we came here with two friends. We're going to go home with many more. So thank you all very much.
That now concludes our lecture, and there will be a reception following in the next room.
And for people who would like a copy of the